My name is Marissa Cole, and I'm 32 years old. A few weeks before my sister's wedding, my parents sat me down and told me I wouldn't be attending, not because there wasn't space, not because of money, but because they decided it would be easier if I wasn't there. I didn't yell, I didn't argue, and I didn't ask them to explain it twice. What made it worse was that I wasn't some distant relative who barely showed up. I was the person they called whenever something went wrong, the one who quietly covered rent when money ran short, paid overdue bills without being asked, and stepped in every time a family crisis needed fixing. Somehow, when everything was calm, I became unnecessary. My parents told me I was overthinking it, that it was just a wedding, that I should be understanding like I always was, and for a moment, I almost believed them. Almost. Instead of fighting, I made a different choice. If I wasn't welcome at the wedding, I wasn't going to hover nearby pretending it didn't hurt. I booked a vacation and packed my bags. No speeches, no ultimatums, just distance. On the morning of the wedding, I wasn't sitting in a church or a banquet hall. I was somewhere else entirely, doing my best to forget how easily I'd been erased. What I didn't know was that while I was gone, everything they thought they had under control was already starting to unravel. And when it finally did, I became the first person they tried to reach. Before we go any further, if you've ever been the one expected to hold everything together while being taken for granted, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Stories like this don't always end the way families expect, but they do reveal who really pays the price. Living in Scottsdale meant living under a quiet kind of pressure that never really went away. Our neighborhood was gated, manicured, and governed by a homeowners association that cared deeply about appearances, from lawn heights to the color of holiday lights. Inside our family, that same obsession with looking put together followed us everywhere. My mother, Patricia, ran our household the same way she approached everything else, with lists, rules, and firm decisions that were presented as final. She liked things orderly, predictable, and calm on the surface, even when tension simmered underneath. My father, Richard, rarely challenged her. He wasn't cruel or loud, just practiced at stepping aside whenever a choice had to be made, letting silence stand in for agreement. My sister Diana grew up sheltered by that arrangement. Problems seemed to dissolve around her before they ever reached consequences, because someone else always stepped in first. Over time, that someone became me. I was the one who got the late calls when bills were overdue or when plans fell apart at the last minute. If a payment needed covering or a conflict needed smoothing over, my name was mentioned casually, as if my help were already assumed. No one framed it as a favor. It was treated like a natural extension of who I was, the reliable one who handled things quietly and without fuss. In Scottsdale, image mattered, and I became part of maintaining it, working behind the scenes, so the family could continue presenting itself as stable and successful. When money ran tight, I was asked to step in temporarily, though temporary had a habit of stretching longer each time. When emotions flared, I was expected to calm everyone down, to say the right thing, to make sure nothing spilled over into public view. My mother praised my maturity while relying on it. My father thanked me softly without ever changing the pattern, and my sister accepted the help as something she deserved. Over the years, my support stopped being noticed and started being expected. I didn't announce what I did, and no one asked how often it cost me sleep or peace of mind. The family simply adjusted around my availability, assuming I would always be there to catch whatever slipped through their fingers. That unspoken arrangement worked as long as I stayed in my place. The moment I didn't, the imbalance became impossible to ignore. In a community like ours, where everyone knew each other's milestones and missteps, the Cole family's sense of order depended on someone quietly absorbing the strain. I had filled that role for so long that it no longer felt optional in their eyes. Being dependable became my identity, and once that identity was taken for granted, respect quietly disappeared with it. A short conversation changed everything. My mother, Patricia, called me one afternoon, and spoke in the same measured tone she used whenever she had already made up her mind. She told me the guest list had been finalized and that my name wasn't on it. There was no build-up, no apology, just a statement delivered as if it were a logistical detail rather than a personal one. When I asked why, she said it would be better this way, that keeping things calm mattered more than anything else, that it was simply easier if I wasn't there. She framed it as a practical choice, something necessary to keep the peace. I didn't interrupt her. I didn't ask what kind of peace required erasing me. My sister Diana was in the room with her, listening quietly. I could hear the pause on the other end of the line when my mother finished speaking, as if waiting for Diana to say something. She didn't. There was no defense, no disagreement, not even discomfort. Silence settled in where support should have been. My father Richard didn't get on the call at all, which was its own answer. I understood then that the decision had already passed through the family without resistance. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask for a reconsideration. I didn't list the ways I had shown up for them or point out the irony of being excluded in the name of harmony. I let the conversation end where my mother wanted it to end, with her certainty intact and my presence quietly removed. After the call, I sat with the feeling longer than I expected, not anger exactly, but a dull clarity that came from seeing the pattern without excuses. Nothing about this was sudden. It was simply the first time the boundary was stated out loud. That evening, I made a decision of my own. I stopped sending money. I canceled the automatic transfers I had set up months earlier, the ones no one asked about anymore because they had become routine. I didn't announce it. I didn't explain it. I didn't frame it as a consequence or a lesson. I just stopped. There was no dramatic gesture attached to it, only quiet follow-through. Days passed, then more days, and nothing happened. No one called to ask if something was wrong. No one checked in. The absence went unnoticed, which told me everything I needed to know about how invisible my contribution had become. I continued with my life, keeping my distance without making a show of it. The family carried on as if the system were still in place, unaware that it had already shifted. In their minds, I was still there, still available, still the solution waiting in the background. They hadn't realized yet that the support they relied on had been voluntary all along. By choosing silence instead of argument, I removed myself without creating a scene. I didn't need their agreement to step back. I only needed to stop pretending that my presence was guaranteed. Leaving Scottsdale didn't feel dramatic. It felt necessary. I packed without rushing, without anger driving my hands, and without the urge to prove anything to anyone. This wasn't about revenge or making a statement. It was about distance, the kind that lets you breathe without checking your phone every few minutes. I didn't tell my family I was going, and I didn't wait for permission or acknowledgement. I chose somewhere far enough that I couldn't be pulled back on impulse, somewhere that made it clear I was unavailable without having to explain why. While I was gone, my life moved at a quieter pace. I focused on my own routine, my own schedule, and the relief of not being on standby. Back in Scottsdale, life continued as if nothing had changed. My mother, Patricia, moved forward with wedding preparations, confident that everything would fall into place the way it always had. My father, Richard, stayed on the sidelines, offering occasional comments but no direction, assuming that calm would somehow maintain itself. My sister Diana was busy with details and expectations, surrounded by people who kept telling her how perfect everything would be. None of them questioned my absence. They still believed I would step in if something went wrong, that I would answer if the situation required it, because that was how it had always worked. The first signs of strain were small enough to dismiss. A disagreement over seating arrangements lingered longer than it should have. A vendor conversation ended without resolution. Tension crept into moments that were supposed to be simple, and no one quite knew how to smooth it over. In the past, those problems would have been redirected to me, framed as minor issues I could easily handle. This time, there was no one to pass them to. Instead of being addressed, they hovered unresolved and uncomfortable. I heard about some of it in fragments later, not through panic, but through casual remarks that hinted at friction beneath the surface. What stood out wasn't the scale of the issues but the hesitation surrounding them. People talked around decisions instead of making them, waiting for clarity that never arrived. The family dynamic shifted subtly, like a structure missing a support beam that hadn't yet collapsed, but no longer felt stable. From where I was, that contrast was impossible to ignore. My days were calm, predictable, and mine alone, while theirs grew increasingly cluttered with expectations no one knew how to manage. The distance did what I needed it to do. It removed me from the reflex to fix things, from the role I had played for so long without question. I wasn't monitoring updates or bracing for calls. I was simply gone physically and emotionally, and the family was left to navigate a system that had relied on me more than they realized. They still believed I would return if needed, that my absence was temporary, and my availability unchanged. The reality, though, was already different. By stepping away quietly, I created a gap they hadn't prepared for, and for the first time, there was no one ready to fill it. The shift didn't happen all at once. It started quietly, almost politely. Back in Scottsdale, the wedding week moved forward with schedules and checklists, but the atmosphere felt tighter than anyone wanted to admit. Small disagreements surfaced between the two families, the kind that usually get smoothed over with a quick decision or a calm word. This time, those moments lingered. A seating plan became a point of tension instead of logistics. Conversations about timing turned sharp, then evasive. Each side assumed the other would eventually give in, and no one stepped forward to settle anything decisively. My mother, Patricia, tried to keep control by pushing through choices without discussion, insisting that confidence alone would make things work. My father, Richard, stayed close enough to observe, but far enough to avoid responsibility, nodding along while offering no real direction. My sister Diana absorbed the stress, unevenly pulled between expectations and reassurance that never quite arrived. As plans shifted, a few organizational decisions were made too quickly and without consensus. A last-minute change to the schedule left vendors confused. A miscommunication led to a delay that rippled through the day's timeline. Nothing was catastrophic on its own, but each misstep added friction. A service interruption that would have been resolved with a phone call turned into a drawn-out exchange because no one wanted to take charge. People began speaking over each other instead of listening, and the room filled with that strained politeness that signals trouble beneath the surface. In the past, moments like these would have been redirected to me, framed as things I could handle quietly. Without that option, problems stacked instead of disappearing. The absence of a steady hand became noticeable, not because anyone named it, but because nothing felt anchored anymore. Scottsdale has a way of magnifying these moments. In a community where appearances matter, where neighbors recognize one another's events, and talk, the pressure to perform grows heavier with every raised eyebrow. Guests noticed the tension. Side conversations paused and restarted. People glanced around, sensing that something was off, even if they couldn't say what it was. The family's image, so carefully curated, began to feel fragile. Attempts to lighten the mood fell flat, because no one was truly relaxed. Decisions kept getting deferred, waiting for someone to take responsibility. As the day progressed, the gaps became harder to ignore. A vendor left early after a disagreement over timing. A minor scheduling error forced guests to wait longer than planned, feeding irritation. Each issue fed the next, not enough to cause a collapse, but enough to drain the room of ease. The effort to maintain a perfect exterior started to show cracks, and those cracks drew attention. Conversations that should have been celebratory turned cautious. People spoke in lowered voices, checking reactions before committing to anything. The atmosphere grew heavy, not with drama, but with uncertainty. The most striking part was how everyone seemed to expect the situation to correct itself. There was an underlying assumption that someone would step in, smooth things over, and restore balance. That expectation lingered even as the hours passed. No one realized that the role they were waiting on was no longer being filled. Instead of order, there was hesitation. Instead of clarity, there was avoidance. The wedding continued technically intact, but the spirit shifted. What should have felt joyful became controlled and brittle. In a place like Scottsdale, where social perception carries weight, that shift mattered. The family could feel eyes on them measuring every pause and misstep. Maintaining appearances took more energy than celebrating, and the strain showed. By the end of the day, nothing had fully fallen apart, yet nothing felt right either. The event moved forward, but without warmth, without ease, and without anyone able to guide it back on course. The absence of structure was subtle but decisive. It didn't announce itself with a scene. It settled in, quietly reshaping the day into something stiff and uncomfortable. The realization came too late that what had been missing all along wasn't just help, but the presence of someone willing to hold things together without needing to be asked. The calls began without warning. My phone lit up with my mother Patricia's name again and again, the kind of repeated ringing that turns urgency into pressure. When I didn't answer, the messages followed, short at first, then longer, the tone shifting from controlled to strained. She wanted to talk. She said just a quick conversation, as if everything could be steadied by the right words. I let the phone stay silent. Soon after, my sister Diana reached out, her messages different in texture, less polished and more desperate. She asked where I was, asked if I could call back, asked if I could help for just a moment. There were no accusations, only appeals, the kind that assume a yes before the question has even finished. My father Richard didn't call at all. His absence was consistent, a familiar retreat when things required ownership. Instead of stepping forward, he stayed out of the exchange, allowing the urgency to funnel toward me. The realization was sharp and oddly calm at the same time. The balance had shifted and they felt it. I didn't rush to respond. I read what was sent, noted what wasn't said, and kept my distance. The requests piled up as the situation back home grew heavier. Patricia's certainty had thinned into insistence, Diana's confidence into pleading. They were no longer asking me to be understanding. They were asking me to fix something they couldn't control. The moment that clarified everything came from someone outside the immediate circle. Elaine Foster called me later that day, introducing herself carefully before explaining why she was reaching out. She spoke plainly without drama, laying out what had happened and what was still unfolding. She described the aftermath in detail, the strained conversations, the mismanaged responses, the way decisions stalled without direction. She didn't exaggerate or soften it. She explained how my absence had exposed gaps no one knew how to fill. How tasks I used to handle quietly were now bouncing between people unwilling or unprepared to take them on. Elaine wasn't blaming anyone. She was recounting facts, and those facts carried weight. She talked about the pressure building in the room, the confusion among guests, the visible frustration when expectations weren't met. She mentioned how often someone said my name in passing, not with anger, but with an assumption that I would eventually step in. Listening to her, I understood the full scope of what had been taken for granted. My role had never been officially assigned yet. It had been essential. Elaine paused after she finished, leaving space for a response. I thanked her for explaining and said nothing more. When the calls resumed, I finally answered one, not to negotiate but to listen. Patricia spoke quickly, outlining problems and timelines, presenting urgency as a reason to comply. Diana followed, her voice tight, asking me to come back, asking me to help her through what was supposed to be the happiest time of her life. I didn't interrupt either of them. I didn't argue or defend myself. I let them speak until the requests ran out of momentum. When there was nothing left to add, I responded simply. I told them I had heard what they said. I didn't promise to return. I didn't offer solutions. I didn't volunteer advice. Silence filled the space where reassurance usually lived. That silence did more than any explanation could have. It made clear that the dynamic had changed. The power had shifted away from expectation and toward choice. I wasn't withholding help to punish anyone. I was declining to resume a role that had been assumed without consent. The realization landed unevenly on the other end of the line. There was disbelief, then frustration, then a pause where understanding began to surface. I ended the call without committing to anything. Afterward, the messages slowed. The urgency remained, but it no longer had leverage. For the first time, my family was forced to confront the consequences of my absence without the safety net of my availability. They were discovering what it meant to lose something they had never acknowledged needing. I stayed where I was, listening when I chose to listen, refusing to be pulled back by habit. I didn't owe them a return. I owed myself consistency, and that meant holding the boundary I had set even when the pleas grew louder. At some point, clarity replaced urgency. I didn't return their calls, not out of spite, but because the answer had already settled in me. When I finally spoke, I kept my words plain. I said I wasn't coming back. I said I wouldn't be providing help, advice, or money. I didn't argue about fairness or revisit old conversations, and I didn't explain myself beyond what was necessary. The decision didn't require their approval. It required consistency. My mother, Patricia, tried to frame it as temporary, something we could discuss later when emotions cooled. I declined the discussion. My sister Diana asked me to reconsider, not with anger, but with a quiet panic that came from realizing the safety net was gone. I listened without interrupting, then repeated myself. There would be no return and no support. My father, Richard, remained on the edge of the exchange, offering soft acknowledgments without taking a position, as if neutrality could soften the outcome. It didn't. Once the boundary was stated, the consequences followed quickly. Without my financial backing, overdue balances became visible instead of absorbed. Plans that depended on flexibility tightened. Commitments that had been made, assuming my availability, had to be renegotiated or abandoned. The family adjusted, but not gracefully. At the same time, the social effects began to show. In a community like Scottsdale, people notice patterns. When expectations aren't met, questions form and explanations thin. Invitations cooled, conversations shifted. The image my family had relied on required maintenance they no longer knew how to provide. I didn't comment on any of it. I didn't correct assumptions or offer context. Silence was enough. Choosing not to engage was not the same as disappearing. It was a refusal to be pulled back into a role that had cost me more than it gave. I didn't accuse anyone or tally past favors. I didn't need to. The absence spoke for itself. Each request I declined reinforced the change. Each pause on the other end of the line confirmed that the dynamic had broken. I wasn't trying to teach a lesson. I was protecting a line I should have drawn earlier. The emotional weight of the choice surprised me by how steady it felt. There was no surge of relief or anger, just a quiet resolve. I stopped monitoring updates and stopped preparing responses. Messages slowed, then stopped. The space that opened wasn't empty. It was calm. Cutting ties didn't require drama. It required a clear answer and the willingness to hold it. By choosing silence over debate, I ended a pattern that depended on my participation. The family faced the results of that choice on their own, financially and socially, while I stayed where I was, committed to the boundary I had set and the life I intended to keep. Time did what arguments never could. Without my involvement, the Cole family settled into a new reality that no amount of explanation could soften. The financial support they once treated as a given was gone, and with it, the quiet stability it had provided. Bills were managed more carefully, plans became smaller, and flexibility disappeared. Decisions carried weight now because there was no unseen buffer absorbing mistakes. The shift wasn't dramatic, but it was permanent. In Scottsdale, where consistency and reputation matter, the absence was noticed. The family's image, once maintained through smooth coordination and quiet problem-solving, fractured under scrutiny. Invitations slowed, conversations shortened, and the unspoken understanding that they no longer operated from a place of ease became common knowledge. People didn't need details. They sensed imbalance and adjusted accordingly. My parents, Patricia and Richard, adapted in different ways. Patricia became more guarded, less certain, no longer assuming control would resolve everything. Richard remained distant, avoiding confrontation with the changes he had allowed to happen. My sister Diana moved forward with her life, but without the assurance that someone else would catch her when things tilted. None of this came with closure or reconciliation. It came with adjustment. From my side, the outcome was simpler. I didn't feel regret, and I didn't feel vindicated. I felt aligned. I stayed where I was, continued building a life that didn't depend on crisis or expectation, and kept my distance intact. There were moments when silence felt heavy, but it was a clean weight, not the constant pressure I had carried before. I didn't reach out, and I didn't wait for them to do so. The boundary held because it was no longer negotiated. The lesson became clear without needing to be announced. Blood ties don't excuse imbalance, and loyalty doesn't require self-erasure. Families often recognize sacrifice only after it stops, and appreciation that arrives too late changes nothing. What matters is not how much you give, but whether what you give is respected while you are still giving it. I learned that choosing boundaries over familiarity is not abandonment, it is self-preservation. People who benefit from your silence rarely notice its cost until it ends. By stepping away and staying away, I didn't punish anyone. I simply removed myself from a pattern that depended on my compliance. The consequences unfolded on their own, long-term and unavoidable, while I moved forward without looking back.